Everyone's focused on AI. I think a lot of people also forget there's another generation coming through. Really forward-thinking organizations are already thinking about B2B might be like, oh, they're not relevant, but they are.
How do I lead a workforce that's got the different generational changes?
The strength of an organization comes from its stories and its traditions, but the future of an organization rests in its...
Welcome to the REV UP Rebellion, the podcast for revenue leaders rewriting the rules of growth. I'm your host, Abbie White. Today's episode, we have got with us Ashley Fell. Ashley is a keynote speaker. She's Director of Advisory and Social Researcher at McCrindle. Ash, I want to kickstart with a bit of a big question. What in your line of work, from what you're seeing, is a bit of a big conversation right now that perhaps you don't think revenue leaders are having, but they should be? What's kind of like the unsaid right now that really should be on the table, and we're going to put it on the table?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely biased, I think, because I work in this area, but I just find that a lot of people maybe aren't aware of the generational change piece that's coming. I think everyone's focused on AI, and that's so understandable, and it should be a big focus, but who you're leading, the different generations coming through. And I find that a lot of the time people are aware of Gen Z, and emerging leaders are like, oh, I need to recruit and attract and retain, those in their 20s and 30s. And that's so relevant, and we do need to focus on that. But I think a lot of people also forget there's another generation coming through. They're only 16, the oldest of them, in Gen Alpha, but they're going to be in our workforces soon. They've got incredible earning and purchasing power that I think a lot of people maybe underestimate. So again, I just have to remind myself, not everyone thinks in generations. I'm like, but this is every day. And what do you mean you don't know that Gen Alpha are coming and they're so influential and they're the largest generation? But they're coming. I think they're going to have big impacts. So keeping them on the radar, but just the whole generational change piece, I think is really important.
I love that. So Gen Alpha, what do we need to know about Gen Alpha? What is coming? What's in store?
Yeah.
God help us.
Yeah. Anyone who knows the term skibbity Ohio Riz, that kind of Gen Alpha slang is coming through. I'm sure those who have Gen Alphas in their life will know that. I mean, they are speaking a different language. They're going to be the largest generation, like in terms of their size, based on sort of current fertility rates and projections. The next generation, who began being born this year in Gen Beta, they're not going to be as large, it's predicted. So largest generation demographically, of course, they're the generation that began being born in 2010. So they're incredibly tech savvy, digitally integrated. They began being born the same year that the iPad was launched and Instagram was released. And so they're not going to know a world without these things. So they're incredibly tech savvy. They're digitally integrated. They're global. And they've got, as I said, like an incredible purchasing power already, because I think of the technologies that have shaped them. They're already influencing their families and their purchasing behavior there. Very confident as a generation that I'm sure many parents can attest to. So I think keeping them on the radar and being aware that they're coming is going to be really important.
So I'm going to pause on generational change for a second. I really, really, really want to come back and dive into that. But if I go with leadership first, I think it is a insanely interesting time to be a leader. And I think there's some really interesting conversations that leaders are having to navigate through AI, through change, the generations. Like, there's so many different things, markets, tariff changes, you name it. There's so many different things as leaders that we're having to navigate through. If you kind of were speaking to a leader looking at the year ahead, thinking, okay, what do you need to prepare for? What needs to be on your radar to be effective as a leader this year? From the trends and insights you're seeing, what's kind of your take to leaders?
I mean, it's hard to choose just one. We often talk about demographic changes that are happening, economic. We talk in mega trends. So demographic, economic, social, technological. I mean, the big one, I think, for a lot of people is the technological space. But for a leader, I think especially, it's how you lead your organization through that kind of change. We're on that brink of that next sort of transformation with AI particularly. And we just see in our research all the time, people are a bit scared or anxious. Will artificial intelligence take their job, and all of those things? And so I think as a leader, if you can provide reassurance and your leadership style, I mean, we've seen across the generations and over time, in the past, it was about authoritarian leadership, hierarchical. You'll listen to me because I'm the boss. I have all the answers. Whereas I think today people are responding to a bit more honesty, but you still need to be confident. You still need to lead. And so I think that tension, but also for leaders to be curious, I think that's a really important leadership character quality that we're starting to see emerge, because the future's so unknown and there's so much change. If you're curious, if you're open to change, whether that is the demographic changes impacting your organization, your business, or the generational or the technological, those who are curious. So I think it's about leadership style. I think that's what's going to be really important as we enter the next year, as we enter the next 5 years, in terms of how people lead their other people and their organization through all the change that's coming.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I feel like even though I'm supposed to be talking about, sales, growth, go to market, I feel like now over 50% of my conversations are actually conversations about change and change management and embracing change, whether that's yourself, whether it's others. So I feel like it really is like the area to lean into right now. Can you change? And like, how do you change?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know there's this amazing quote, I think it's Patrick Lencioni, who said the greatest advantage for a company is not the finances or strategy, it's teamwork. And so even that idea that even if you're great at the finance and your revenue, and that is a responsibility of revenue leaders, of course, that has to be a focus, but also how you lead your team and how you unite them in the midst of all the change that's going on. I mean, it's a lot for leaders to on their shoulders. But yeah, definitely the change management piece. Like if you can be a leader that is open to new ways of doing things and open and curious, I think that sets you really apart, because so many people sit in that change apathy or change fatigue mindset and they don't want to respond. And it's daunting. Like you said, as humans, I don't think we love change in personal or professional spheres, but the world around us is changing so rapidly. The future's going to look quite different to that of the past. And so those leaders that can lead their teams well through that, I think, are at a real advantage.
Yeah, and I agree with you on the change fatigue. There's been so much over the past few years that it's just everyone's getting quite tired with it. You picked out their technology and AI. I'm so sorry, everyone. Got to do it. Got to talk about AI. From the data, the insights, the research that you're looking at, what do we need to really know about AI if we're a revenue leader?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just an openness towards it. And we see a lot in our research when we ask employed Australians about how they feel about it. There's definitely a real mix in the sentiment. And I think that's probably quite indicative of how we all feel. Like you hear and you see the productivity gains and you're like, wow, this is amazing. I love this. I'm going to lean in so hard. And then you hear a kind of like a scary story about how it's been mistreated or misused. I was at an AI workshop recently and they were doing this really interesting exercise about the years 2035, and it was like scenario planning. It was like AI has gone amazing and we've captivated it and it's productive, and what does the world look like? And then the inverse of that was we haven't looked after it responsibly or ethically. What's the impact on the next generation? And it was just a really kind of daunting conversation. The whole like we're at this not breaking point, but like the precipice of this new thing. In the same way that in the past we were on the precipice of maybe the fax machine. Like sometimes in the keynotes I deliver, I think about, and I try and get the audience to think about at what point in time in the past were we on the brink of this new thing and someone was up on the stage being like, the fax machine, don't worry, it's not going to take your job. Like that kind of idea. It's like we are at the iteration of the next. And AI is, of course, really different and more intelligent, as the name suggests, than a fax machine. So we have to treat it responsibly, but it's going to come with us into the future. And so I think if you're a revenue leader, it's about working out how you can leverage it and use it for productivity gains, but also deal with it responsibly and bring your team on the journey. And I think that's a challenge, I think, at the moment, because what I've seen is a lot of people are using it. People are experimenting, which is fantastic if they're open and curious about it. But in an organization, if it's not streamlined, if there's not a coordinated approach, people are kind of just off. It's almost like guerrilla warfare. Like I'm off doing this, you're off doing that. But it's like the concerted approach, the cohesive approach, I think is really important. And again, the role of a leader to introduce that, get across it themselves. And yeah, I think it's exciting, the future with AI. And for me as a futurist, we know it's going to be a part of the future. So you kind of, I think there's the hard reality of you need to get on board. But yeah, using it well is definitely, I think, it's got to be on the radar of all of us, and that responsible use of it. But how you leverage, like any new technology, how you leverage the benefits and mitigate the challenges. That's always the tension I think we've got to face.
Yeah, and it's definitely there. Some of the security risks, some of those sorts of risks, people using it irresponsibly, risks around company data. Like I totally get that. But I agree, some of the gains to be had, like some of those people, I feel like a few months ago, everyone was dabbling, and maybe this is just my lens, but everyone was dabbling. Whereas I think like now, I'm seeing a few outliers who are really getting ahead, and they've got some really good user cases, some really good ROI, and they've kind of, the horse is bolted and they've gone.
Yeah.
And you're like, wow, that gains is there. Most of us are kind of in the middle going like, we're dabbling, we're playing, we need to do something. And then there's a few kind of behind. So I think it's almost like now's the time to put your foot on the gas, but like you said, with the right guardrails to be able to do so in safely, so you're not sort of putting risks to the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And leveraging, maybe younger generations who have that openness to change and who are like, I can come in. Like even with our own organization, we've got a few younger team members who just are curious and hungry. And those of us who are a bit older, who are a bit like, oh, this is a bit daunting. They're just like, oh, let me have a go. And within the guidelines and within the parameters, or it's a professional development session that's run by an organization or company that you trust, or online workshop. Like there's so many avenues for learning and exploration. And so I think, that can also be part of the strategy, is leveraging those who are curious and hungry to learn about it, and then can upskill everyone else. So it's definitely an interesting time. There's lots of, like you said, I think different people on the scale of, ambitious and new and happy and excited, compared to those of us maybe who are a bit more kind of anxious about it. But again, bringing everyone on the journey, I think, is going to be really key. And I heard this great quote recently that it was talking about how AI is not going to replace you in the future, but it needs to come with you. And that idea that, and one of our trends that we talked about is humanit AI, which is a play on the word humanity. And the idea that we are going to work with AI. It's going to be humans and AI in the future. So how we learn how to work with the technology, but also equally important are those human skills, because what AI and technology is doing is hopefully outsourcing kind of the menial tasks, or the drudgery, the repetitive stuff. And it can open, hopefully, us up as humans to more higher order thinking and creating and collaborating. So hopefully, if we can view it in that regard, hopefully people are excited about the productivity gains. And like you said, there are probably many organizations and leaders who are like, love it. There's so many benefits. And so, leveraging that and leaning into that is, I think, going to be exciting to see and to navigate.
Yeah. And I think those 2 points you've kind of also made kind of come together. Like maybe you've got someone in your team who's eager beaver, who's experimenting, and then back to the teamwork point, like how do they come back and knowledge share? Yeah. We started playing around with like what I learned this month or what I learned this week. And like everyone had to have a dabble or a play with something, but then the knowledge sharing, so that those are then, they're bringing everybody else on the journey, and you've got the knowledge sharing going.
We're talking about how marketing and advertisement has changed, and that's my world, and talking about trends and stuff. And my father-in-law was like, oh yeah, what about all this AI stuff? I'm like, it's pretty cool, And I brought up just like ChatGPT, and I just showed him, like, I was like, what would have been one of your tasks that you had to do, like write a quote for XYZ? And he was like, yeah, that's what I would do, and it'd take me X amount of time. And so I just jumped on ChatGPT and put in some like random information, and watched his eyes kind of like light up when he saw like how quickly it was done. And so it is cool as well when you bring people on the journey, you can upskill, you can learn together, like, again, leaning into the benefits and showcasing those in a way that is not isolating of people and making them feel on the outside or redundant, but actually like, this is how it can help you. This is how it helps us as a team, as an organization. So definitely, I think that group learning environment, upskilling, we're on the journey together mindset, I think can be really powerful.
It's funny you say that, because I've kind of feel like I'm learning the other way at the moment, because I've got a 6-year-old. And the other day he thought he was being really, really funny, and he asked, I can't say it because our phones are going to start going off, but he asked Siri, basically, find abbiewhite.com, and he thought he was being hilarious to try and find me online, and of course asking Siri to do so. And Siri returns another Abbie White. Can you believe it? There is another Abbie White out there. And then I realized I had a massive issue in the business, because it was ABBY and it was finding other ones ABBEY. Then I'm pinging my team going, oh my God, we need to work on our SEO, because it's actually pulling up different Abbie Whites. But then watching some of how when he wants to find something out, he is literally just asking Siri straight away, or he has a full-on conversations with ChatGPT. And as part of me finds it like really scary as his mum, the other part of me is watching going, okay, hang on, how do I lean into that as a business opportunity? Because this is what we're all now doing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there are so many stories. When we were working on the Generation Alpha book that Mark McCrindle and I co-authored, it was amazing to just talk to parents, like yourself, and hear the stories and how their kids are talking to those voice command assistants, Alexa, like, hey Alexa, play Bluey or play Peppa Pig, or what's the weather going to be today? And I think that is just a case case in point of how technology has made our lives so simple. A little story I heard, it was a child in the car with their mum, and they said, "Mum, you were alive before phones, right?" And the mum's like, "Yeah." And the child's like, "I'm just curious, like, how did you know where to go, like before Google Maps and Apple Maps?" And the mum's like, "Well, we had books that lived in the car called street directories, and they were full of maps, and you get it out and navigate to where you had to go." And the child thought about that for a second, and they said, "Like a pirate?"
Oh, that's so good.
And that, you know, for a child, it's like incomprehensible, like that you would have to get out paper and navigate because they've only known that world. And I think it's a bit of a metaphor maybe for all of us, because I think as consumers, we all expect things to be today really simple and easy. And one of the things we talk about in presentations is like the simplicity as a service. And that idea that we all as consumers want things to be immediate, simple. The idea that if you've made a decision about purchasing something and you go on a website and you can't find the buy now button, probably give it like 30 seconds and you're like, it's in the too hard basket. Like,
not even. Yeah.
Not wasting my time anymore with this. And that's just going to be exacerbated for the younger generations like your son, who are used to that kind of immediate, you know, instant gratification, which has got, again, benefits and challenges to mitigate, because we know that patience is a virtue and resilience and all those things. So there's challenges we have to navigate with all of that, as every generation in the past has gone through. But it's just so interesting to look at the behavior of young people as a lens to the future and what work is going to be like for them and how they're going to work. And it's a cool story that your son's interaction with technology is like translating to business outcomes for you. That's cool.
Oh, he's like my number one business advisor. The other day I was explaining what a dictionary was. It's quite fascinating. But if I take that train of thought around generational trends and I think about it and apply it with revenue leaders, I think there's two different parts to this conversation. One part for me is from an employee perspective. So there's a lot of, and potentially we do some myth busting here, because there's a lot of stereotypes potentially around Gen Z. They can't pick up the phone, you know, from a sales perspective. How do I get them to pick up the phone? How do I get them to go face to face? And there's a lot of stereotypes and conversations there. So how do I lead a workforce that's got the different generational changes? And like you said, Gen Z probably gets picked on the most. And then there's the other side of that fence, which is then the changing buyer profile, and then we're selling to a different buyer, as you sort of started to touch on. If I take the workforce first, what are you sort of seeing around the insights there of how we manage this almost intergenerational you know, sales and revenue generating teams? And like, what do the insights tell us? How do we navigate and manage this?
Yeah, it's a big topic of, I think, conversation, because a lot of people, I think, are struggling. I mean, first of all, we've got more generations mixing in our communities because we're living longer, so people are working later. You've got Gen Z who are coming through, and Gen Z are really interesting at the moment because the youngest of them are 16, so they're technically still in school and post-school pathways. The oldest are 30, so they're also leaders of their own right. Some of them are parents if they're having children typically younger than the median age. So there's lots of, they're just a fascinating generation. And a lot of people come to us and they're like, I need to understand Gen Z. Like we run workshops and sessions and studies about just understanding them because they are the new and the next generation that people are thinking about. We did this big study last year, which was kind of called Thriving Intergenerational Teams. And we looked at particularly the workforce component and the differences and the qualms that come up. And the biggest one is often around communication. And you mentioned it there, like the stereotype that Gen Z don't want to pick up the phone. You call them and they're not going to answer. They're like, why didn't you text me first? Like that kind of mindset. And to be honest, some of the research did indicate that that's kind of true. Like their preference is to, actually, one thing that was really interesting was when we asked about preference of communication in the workplace, face-to-face came up as number one for every generation, which was a little bit surprising. But then it went, as you went down the list of, options that we gave them and priorities, it was older generations who would err on the side of phone calls, whereas Gen Z were more like email. They would just, defer to that. And so I think especially from a sales and revenue perspective, at the core of this, sales and revenue is about relationships. And so I think there does need to be a little bit of like mentoring from older generations to younger generations in a workplace context around what has worked well. And there's a time and a place for an email, yes, but there's definitely time and a place when you might need to have a face-to-face meeting with someone and sit in that discomfort. And I guess for me, what's also a really interesting question, which I don't feel guilty about saying, but it kind of, because I love and I believe in generational theory and analysis. But sometimes I get asked the question, what's characteristic of a generation compared to what's characteristic of a life stage? And so
that's an interesting point.
Like, were the baby boomers when they were in their 20s also a bit, cautious and nervous, and older generations would have said at the time, oh, those baby boomers, they're so lazy and entitled. Like, so sometimes I think it's cyclic, like it's a cycle, and some things are said about just young people in general, whoever the generation is at the time. But then what we do is we look at the context that's shaped each generation and how technologies and societal events play into that. So I think the pandemic, all of those technologies that we're talking about, they do shape a generation. And it's no wonder that Gen Z would prefer to, behave in a certain way when you look at the technologies that they've grown up using from the youngest of ages. And even with Gen Alpha as well, like them not knowing a world without the iPad will impact them in different ways to those of us that remember a time before these things existed in our lives, with the whole pirate, example and that sort of story. So I think understanding that each generation has come from a different context is, first of all, really important in a workplace. And also just being able to tailor and adapt. And I think that goes both ways. I think oftentimes, younger generations have to kind of take on that humble position and go, I am new, and they're quite a confident generation coming through, I think, but they have to go, okay, well, how does this work? What's the culture here in this organization, and how can I adapt to that? But in the same breath, older generations, I think, also have to recognize that what has worked in the past may not work with this next cohort, and how you lead them and how you mentor them. Like, if you're just saying, well, this is how you need to do it, and otherwise there's the door, they're not exhibiting that loyalty that we've seen with other generations. And sometimes that's viewed as a character flaw, but I personally don't see it that way. And so just working out how you can leverage their strengths and their openness to technology, but also bring them on that journey and guide them with regards to how you do things in your organization, the culture piece. I think that's going to be really important. It is definitely a tension. We see a lot of tensions there around communication preferences. One other thing I'll say just with regards to the employee perspective of generations is, in that study, we asked what attracts people to a new job, and we gave like 17 different options, and it was so interesting to differentiate them by generation because they were really, really different. So for Gen Z, number one is career development, pathways and opportunities. For Gen Y, flexibility. For Gen X, remuneration. For baby boomers, convenient location. And so then there was all these other options that kind of came out in the wash in the rest of the answers. But for every generation to have a top different one, I think, was also indicative of the different life stages. Like the Gen Ys and millennials, they're thick in this life stage of kids. So of course they want flexibility. But even that perception that, Gen Z, they just want to work from home all the time, I think that's a bit of a misconception, because they're the generation who do want to come in to some workplaces because they know that they need to learn. You learn through osmosis just by being around people. They're at the start of their careers. They want that development. And they're also looking to the workplace for connection and community, I think, more than other generations who are more involved in traditional forms like churches and Rotary clubs and other community groups. So yeah, there's so many things, but understanding and appreciating difference in a workplace, I think, is kind of the starting point, and creating a culture of respect for every generation. I think that's really key.
And it's interesting because even the fact you're talking there in some of your examples about the fact you're going in and running workshops and educating, actually, is that some of the first step? Because you're then almost creating that greater understanding both ways. Because we can all talk about, I'm really fixated on action and going, okay, cool, we can all talk about it, but how do you actually start, building the bridge and, taking steps? And is that part of it? Like in those workshops, I can imagine it's probably quite eye-opening.
Yes. And it starts...
is it group therapy?
Pretty much. It's the busting stereotypes, I think, and coming at it with empathy. And we have this table, like some of the visuals we use, where we look at each generation and what was the transformative technology that shaped them, from the fax machine through to AI. What was the transformative communication style, from memos and emails through to virtual messaging? And when people see that, all their phones go up and they're taking photos because they're like, oh, okay, this is helping me understand why someone is the way they are, almost, instead of going, why are they addicted to their phones? It's because they've had it from their formative years. And there's a saying, and it's behind every child or young person using a phone, there's 10 developers making it as addictive as possible. You know, when you understand that, you go, okay, maybe I will judge them less and come at it from understanding. So yeah, I mean, every generation I think has got their strengths and challenges or weaknesses, if you will. And one example I often use in those workshops, which is a very wholesome kind of movie example, is the movie The Intern with Robert De Niro and Anne Hathaway. And I think it's a really relatable story because, you know, when you're working with someone who is really different to you, in this case, it's the generational kind of age difference. And you're like, oh, they almost discount each other. Like there's a relevance. They don't get my generation. Why is he carrying that old briefcase? Like they don't see the value that they can bring. But when then they build relationship and build trust, that's when they become each other's mentors. And I think that's always really with everything, easy to say, hard to action and actually live out. But when you approach it from a place of respect, and I find that in my workplace too, like I've got colleagues who are like 5 years younger than me. We're in different generations, even though they're only 5 years younger. And some days I'm like, wow, that generational difference could not be more obvious.
Yeah.
But I think, and hopefully they would say the same, that because I'm a leader of one of them in my team, and it comes from a place of like almost like intergenerational banter, and you know, we have fun with it and we lean into it, but that's only able to happen because there's respect and trust and when you don't have that, and then that's where you get the snide comments and the snarky comments. And yeah, again, it's just so easy to talk about in theory. It's hard to live out in practice, but it can be done. You can work with people of a different generation. You can get good outcomes and respect. Yeah. And when people lean into that, again, it's that teamwork advantage that I think propels organizations forward, which is going to be really important as we look at the future.
Yeah, you got a couple of good examples there, those starting points, which I love. And if we put it the other side of the fence and think about the fact now, okay, so for revenue leaders listening, we're now selling to the different generations. We've now got the digital natives. We've now got, like you gave examples before, right? If it's not quick, easy, I think you were actually pretty generous when you said you'd spend 30 seconds on a website. I think it's probably like 5 seconds and I'm done. Or maybe that's just my patience level. We're kind of selling to a different generation now. So we're having to adapt our go-to-market, our sales, our marketing, because ultimately, you know, the buyer profile is starting to shift.
Yeah.
What are you seeing from, you know, your insights and research on that side of the fence of, you know, from a buyer perspective?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. We've got this really cool infographic which looks at, you know, each generation and what was the marketing style that they've kind of grown up with from, you know, really traditional advertising, like, and it was just so evident in that example that I shared earlier with my parents-in-law, where they're like watching ads, and I'm just like, I haven't seen an ad on TV in like years and years and years. And so for me, the ads are coming through on social media, and it's far more subtle, and it's far more through influencers, and it's so different. And that's where it's tough for, you know, marketers, because each generation is behaving in a really different way. So I think the strategy has to diversify, and obviously you've got to spend that time working out, you know, the consumer profiles that you're serving, the segmentation. And I think the generational piece is one really helpful way to do that. Appreciating that we're all digitally connected, but it's enhanced for the younger generation, that we're all global. And these are some of the characteristics I talk about with regards to consumers: digital, globally connected, socially engaged through social media. And again, very much heightened for younger generations. It reminds me of one of the studies we ran. We asked, where are you turning daily to not just doom scroll or like waste time or be entertained, but to teach yourself a new skill? And 48%, so pretty much 1 in 2 Gen Zs, are turning to TikTok daily to teach themselves a new skill. And
is it just TikTok dances or beyond TikTok dances?
It's beyond TikTok dances.
Just checking.
No, exactly. I mean, I'm sure that is absolutely part of it. But it's just, and it's the idea, I think, that consumers today are really visual, and, you know, we all want and expect things to be communicated in visual ways. We used to have this saying, the number one search engine is no longer Google, it's YouTube, because why would you read something when you can watch it? And so now you've got TikTok that's come in almost like as the new search engine. And I think that is, again, when we think about the context, it's almost rewiring this next generation of consumers' expectations for products and marketing, and again, simplicity, personalization. And it's that idea, I think, that we've all been using, or we've all been, using AI, like without us being aware of it. Like when you go to the self-serve checkout, when you get Spotify personalized recommendations, or on Netflix, like that's AI working in the background, taking in your preferences, giving you a really personalized service and product. In exchange, of course, you give something as well. You give information and data to that platform. But I think for younger generations, that's just going to be a key part of their expectation as consumers. So whether it's the platforms they're on, from traditional, radio, TV advertising through to sort of more influencer marketing, the rise of podcasts, like where young people are turning to learn new things, like understanding how each generation behaves and what they value as consumers as well is really key. One of the things we would talk about with regards to the future consumer, and it's still definitely true today, but it's an interesting kind of shift, is how they really are environmentally aware and conscious. But what we've seen, especially here in Australia over the last few years, is what we've called consumer compromise, where because of the cost of living, we've had to almost, especially younger generations, compromise on those values because the bottom line of the product matters. And that's where you see the rise of the dupe and Depop and the circular economy. So again, understanding like even just their economic footprint and where they're at in their life stage. I mean, the baby boomers, they comprise around a quarter of the population, but they own more than half the nation's private wealth. And so even understanding that component and not discounting them as you think about the future as well. So yeah, there's so many things we could almost look at each one in isolation and talk about how they differ. But I think understanding that they do differ is probably the starting point, and then delving deeper into, okay, who's your target market? What do we know about them? Build that profile, and then personalize the approach that you're using to sell to them, to market to them, to connect with them, because they are behaving in pretty different ways across the generations.
Yeah, and even what you're talking about, I think, gives a really good starting point. Like you said, it is going, right, who are the generations we're serving? Actually, it might be multiple generations.
Yeah.
And so then how are we, doing different marketing to speak to different segments, that personalization? You've talked about the simplicity. You talked about so many different things, but I guess it's also getting intentional around, are you actually doing that generational segmentation, and then how they're going to engage? Because it's not really that one size fits all. And I think what's really interesting for me is I feel, and this is just my perception, that B2C is starting to get ahead on this, and I feel like B2B need to catch up. That's just my personal perspective.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at most stuff, I think B2B follows B2C.
Mm-hmm.
So I think actually as B2B go-to-market teams, we need to actually start thinking about this, because you might have some, I think something like 60% of B2B decision makers in APAC are millennial or Gen Z. But actually you've got different generations there still at the table. And then how are we kind of segmenting that just like a B2C company would?
Yeah.
I think there's a big opportunity there that not many people are leaning into.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting observation. And I see that as well with companies, like when I present and I share about the TikTok stuff, they're like, quick, we have to go to TikTok right now and create an account. And then that's kind of a bit like, I think, scary for a lot of people. But even that whole area of social media where, some brands I think who are doing well at the moment are kind of leaning in and experimenting, and they're getting traction. But that's not often how in the past B2B has operated. And there's been a lot, as rightly so, a lot more red tape, regulations, but the B2C is a bit more like, let's try this, let's do this, and so those companies I think that are experimenting, that are leveraging even younger generations within their teams to go, how do we reach your generation? And I think that's also the beauty of having an intergenerational workforce, is that you can lean on the people who are, say you've got Gen Zs in your team, ask them about what's trending, where their generation are operating. And like you said, they are like B2C, I think, they would be thinking about and talking about Gen Z, but B2B might be like, oh, they're not out relevant, but they are. They're so relevant. They're going to be like Gen Z and Gen Y, like you just mentioned, in the next few years are going to be the biggest composition of the global workforce. And the Gen Zs, yes, the youngest are 16, the oldest are 30, like the really forward-thinking organizations are already thinking about the alphas. And so just being aware that diversity exists, but also not making assumptions, but actually doing the research or asking questions even of your team and going, how do we reach your generation, or what are they valuing, or how can we tweak the strategy so that it cuts through? Because what's going to translate, to a Gen Z audience is maybe not what's going to translate. And I see this sometimes like with our company as well. Like we're a small to medium-sized organization, and we've got our LinkedIn sort of strategy and presence, which is really different to like a TikTok or Instagram reel one, even though we're a B2B, but that's the need for us to almost not operate like a B2C, but think about how can we create content and information. And I mean, we have so much content through our research, but how do we communicate that in different ways, like multi-purpose? How we'd say it on LinkedIn to an older, typically audience is not going to be the tone, or how we're going to do that through a different platform. So appreciating that, experimenting, having a go, I think is going to be hopefully fun and exciting, but also really important.
I feel like we need to crack out some TikToks in a minute.
if we must.
It's interesting you talk about experimenting. I feel like that is such the opportunity right now. I'm obsessed with Adam Grant, who talks about, think again, think like a scientist, that level of like experimentation. And I definitely think there's so much opportunity to be had there. So I think you've also touched on something that's a really actionable takeaway. Like if there's something from what you're saying that people go, oh, that's interesting, how would that work for us? How do you now run an experiment to try it on for size? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it comes back to that idea that those who are like innovating are curious and they're willing to kind of do things. And we have this quote from one of our books that I end almost like every single presentation on that I do. It says, the strength of an organization comes from its stories and its traditions, but the future of an organization rests in its relevance and innovation. And it's the idea that if you want to be a player in the future, you do need to be curious and experiment and take risks. And they need to be calculated, of course. But I think those who have the advantage are not the ones who are going, I know everything and I'm confident. And they're actually the ones who are like humble and curious. And again, it's a leadership shift, because in the past we respected leaders who were authoritarian and had all the answers. And I think today it's more about empathetic leaders who are still confident, but that's like a humble confidence and who are curious. And I think they're the ones who probably bring around them the people that can take their organization well into the future, who again are curious as well and are happy to experiment, happy to try new things. And that idea of failing forward, I think is so important as we think about the future, because it's quite unknown in terms of, which is scary, a scary thought, even as a futurist. There's a lot of change going on. I think it was Justin Trudeau who said the pace of change has never been this fast and it will never be this slow again, which is kind of daunting.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it, isn't it?
Yeah. So that's reality though. It's where we're at, where we're going. So if you can be curious, experiment, take risks, calculated ones, of course, I think that puts you in good stead to thrive in the future. Yeah.
And if I take this forward to then the future of work, it's quite interesting some of what you were talking about there of, there's a lot of myths again at the moment of, we all just want to work from home. No one wants to go back to the office. We're being forced and dragged back to the office. Today it probably felt like that because it's actually soaking in Sydney today and we're all looking a little bit drowned rats. No, you're looking lovely. I'm not. But there's a lot of myths around that. And then you just talk to actually people's communication style preferences, or Gen Z's wanting to come into the office because I want to learn and career is most important to me. Yeah. So what does the data and the trends and insights tell us around that future of work piece?
I mean, gosh, so my job is basically a social researcher. So I get to study like human behavior. And what an interesting time in the last like 5 years to be in this profession. Like,
yeah, I think I want your job.
Yeah, it's so cool. I've been there for like almost 12 years, which is a long time, a lot longer than the average millennial stays in one job for. But it's just so interesting. And like as the world around us was changing so rapidly with the pandemic, we were running so many studies, and we do that every year. But the future of work has been a big topic. Mark and I co-authored a book called Wellbeing, and we actually wrote that book in 2019. It was meant to be published then. There was a delay with the publishing of it. And at the time I was like, oh, it's so annoying. And now I'm like, thank goodness we didn't publish a book about work before COVID came in and changed everything. And we say biggest transformation to work in a century, like just fully, like before the pandemic, there was not a big proportion of people who worked remotely. And now it's so huge. And even with education, it's a big sector we do a lot of work with. Pre-pandemic, education was viewed as like one of the most flexible jobs you could have. You had so many holidays, how amazing. Today, it's fully gone the opposite. Like it's one of the most inflexible jobs, and they're struggling to attract young people because I think with Gen Z, especially, like they've watched like in their formative years was the pandemic. And I was speaking to one recently and they said, like this was recently, as in a couple of years ago. I just remember talking to them. It was probably like 2023, and they had started their work, like they'd finished university in the pandemic and had started working for a tech company, and they'd only worked fully remote for the first like 3 years of their career. Like how different is that to someone who's been in the workforce for 30 or 40 years and all of a sudden work was so place-bound and now it's so flexible? And in the research and the commentary that we deliver, there's definitely, I think, an appreciation for the benefits of working from home. I mean, there's so many, the time savings, the flexibility, especially for a generation like the millennials or the Gen Ys who are in the thick of family and school drop off and kids and sickness and everything. But there's also some challenges too that come with it. And the biggest one from the research that we found was social isolation. And I think for many people, you know, maybe pre-pandemic when, you know, you'd be complaining about your job, you're like, oh, work, like it's so annoying. We all have those days. But also I think what the pandemic did was maybe highlighted for people how important work is beyond the remuneration benefits, like for community, connection, purpose. And when you take that out, and for many people, like for Gen Z, we are seeing an increase in loneliness, and, you know, they're not engaging in those traditional forms of community. I mean, they've got their run clubs and they've got other ways they're exhibiting that these days, but the workplace is almost like that one bottleneck that we all pass through. And so for many people, it's more than just a job and where they go to get paid, it's connection. And I think the pandemic really highlighted that. But in terms of the hybrid world, like when we asked in our survey, what's your preference? It was really interesting. Just 14% said everyone working from home all the time. So the really introverted among us. 62%, I think it was, said a hybrid, a mix. So the majority said a mix. And I think it was 25% said everyone working from the workplace all the time. So I think there's definitely that preference for hybrid, because we want the best of both worlds. We want the connection and the community, and sometimes like the commute and actually having a separation from work and home. It depends on your personality and life stage and generation, I think, as well. But we also appreciate, the benefits that come with working from home. So it's definitely a hybrid. But I think also I would say with regards to workplaces and flexibility, like when we ask Gen Z about what their top hopes for their career are, it's about working with meaning and purpose, a workplace that's got great connections, career development, and flexibility is in there, but it's not in the top 3. And so again, I think it challenges that assumption that we go, oh, young people, they just want to work from home and take advantage, and they don't want to come into the office and work hard like we had to do. I don't think that's actually playing out as much as people might think.
And it's interesting because you say about the career piece. Like, I feel when I was in the early days of particularly my sales career, the program I was on, we did a 2-year program, and I literally was glued to the hip of a sales guy that I was working with. If he was going to a client meeting, I was going to a client meeting. If he was in the office, I was in the office. If he's going for a coffee, I'm going for coffee. We were literally glued to the hip for 2 years. This poor guy was stuck with me for 2 years. You can imagine how hard that was. But you just heard, like, overhearing him on the phone, overhearing like how he was talking about things. Like, it wasn't just, I'd followed him to 1 or 2 meetings and shadowed. It was literally, you saw, right, how does he conduct himself? How does he conduct himself on the hard days? Even just eavesdropping all the conversations and being in the office and hearing different people and different styles on the phone. I'm like, important. That's really good. I'm going to give that one a go later. Yeah. And I think there's all that hidden piece that I think is a massive benefit, that if career progression is important, I think so much of what you learn is actually just overhearing the conversation or the coffee chat. It's that sort of piece.
So important. I once did a LinkedIn post. It was like 10 things I've learned about life and work after 10 years, like in the workforce. And one of the things I wrote about was like that you learn through osmosis, which is a biology term, cells passing through a barrier or something. I'm not very good at biology, so don't quote me on that. But it's the idea that you're learning without you being conscious of you learning. Like even in the example you said, you weren't sitting there writing down, this is how they answer the phone, but you were learning. Yeah. You were learning, you were being exposed to things. It's almost like that idea that you become like the people you spend the most time with. And so I think if you can, like, for advice for younger workers, I think is try and be in the workplace. Like maybe not every single day. If you've got a hybrid like working arrangement, take the benefits of that for sure. But I think where you can go in and learn, because you do learn so much just being around people that you respect and that are ahead of you and where you want to be, and how to do things, how not to do things, how to conflict resolution. Like there are so many things that you just learn by observing and being in that space. So yeah, I think you're spot on with that. I think it's a big thing that I hope we don't lose with the hybrid kind of world if we continue down that pathway.
And I think that you made an interesting point there as well, of those people who started their careers. And it might not be your career full stop. You might have made a career transition, right? Yeah. But from my lens around sales and revenue generating teams, we've had interesting conversations with people who started that role and career path during COVID. They have only ever known Teams and Zoom meetings. So they've never conducted a client presentation or pitch or, meeting face to face, because for the first 3 odd years of their sales career, it was all done virtually.
Yeah.
So then now there's almost like a gap and disconnect between conducting yourself in person in that frame, because that's the only way I learn.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think when you hear those stories, because it can be easy just to pass judgment on those new hires and like, why aren't they up to date like with their skills, or why are they lacking in this area? And then you go, oh, that's why, because we were all forced to work from home. But those of us who are a bit older and more established in our careers, we had those earlier years to actually learn those skills. Whereas this maybe next cohort of new grads or whoever it might be, maybe haven't. So there probably is a need there and a skills gap, but a need to train and to bring them alongside and upskill them in that regard as well. So I think it's an important recognition piece when we are thinking about hiring and attracting and retaining great talent. And then that might be the case for some of that younger generation who, through no fault of their own, that was their start to their working life or that career change. So
yeah. So I think we've done a really good job of actually busting some myths and some stereotypes. I think we've done a brilliant job on that. If we were going to rebel against or bust any other myths, is there any that we haven't really covered when it comes to sort of the generational change, the future of work, and what we're seeing sort of that revenue leaders need to kind of unpack and bust any others?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've covered quite a few. I mean, I just really lean into trying to, I think stereotypes are sometimes helpful, but also, they need to be busted. They need to be kind of challenged. And I think you need to do that as a leader, not just come in with stereotypes about younger generations. And it's almost like I love like a paradox, like the idea that like two opposite things can kind of be the same. And I remember when I was authoring the Generations Defined kind of report that we put together, and I was like, how do I wrap this up? Like I've just spent the whole report talking about the differences. And I remember at the end, I said, I gave 3 pieces of like overarching advice. I said, number 1, you have to understand what differentiates generations. And we've just talked a lot about how they differ as consumers, as employees, how they respond to different marketing, how they spend their time, where their search engine is. But the second point, which was a bit of a paradox, was understand what unites generations and how we're actually the same. And I think that's what you've got to remember through all of the appreciation of the difference, is also that we're all human beings at the end of the day. And yes, we've got different ages and we were shaped in different eras with different from world wars to September 11 to the pandemic. Like what age you were when all those things happened does shape your outlook in some ways, I think, different technologies. But at the end of the day, we're all humans. And I think sales personnel and revenue leaders know that, because as much as we're different, sometimes those timeless truths are so key in terms of we all want to feel like a sense of love and connection and belonging. And in a workplace, we want to feel valued. And that's true of a 55-year-old as well as a 21-year-old. And it might be being expressed differently. So that'd be my kind of encouragement. The third part of that was lead with empathy. And so I think understanding difference, but appreciating similarity and what connects us. And that's your role, I think as well as a leader, especially with setting a culture, is unifying different people coming from different backgrounds, maybe born in different places, or different ages, uniting them to that vision that you're working towards as a team. So yeah, that's, I think, a paradox that I think sometimes we like to maybe overlook. We just want to be simple, but those both opposite things are true. Appreciate difference, but also think about what unites is my encouragement.
Yeah, I like that. We've covered so much ground. If there was one thing that you were going to leave revenue leaders with, or I know you do a huge amount of keynote speaking, you are on the road a massive amount. If there's one sort of real, first step that people can take, first thing people can do, one thing you want people to walk away with, what would it be?
I think it's an appreciation of the tension of the difference. And again, as I mentioned, in terms of the generational piece, but just in terms of the future and being excited and curious and leaning into that. Because I understand, like from the research and all the speaking events I do and speaking to people, like there's a lot of fear, and that's so understandable. And even when we were working on the Generation Alpha book, it was quite amazing to see almost how fearful people are of the future, and even for the next generation. Like some people are like, what a terrible time to be a young person. And I'm thinking, like, sure, it's good to have like a bit of realism, but we also need optimism as well. And one of the things we talk about with regards to leaning into the future is having a realistic perspective, but an optimistic posture. And that idea that, again, like you need to have both as a leader, like you need to be real about the challenges, whether that be revenue based or financial or whatever's going on internally in your organization or externally in the environment. But you also need to lead and to inspire and instruct the people that are following you. And so I think there's, again, just operating in the tension. And I think about, again, that quote that I love to end the presentation on is, the strength in the history and the legacy and leaning into that, but also having, a curious kind of experimental future perspective posture around the future. And that requires an ability to let the team try something new and not do so well and learn from that, failure, so to speak. So that kind of innovation is really key for the future. But that doesn't mean you can't, still value history and tradition and legacy. And I hope that speaks to older generations as well, because sometimes we talk about the next generation and Gen Z and I think older generations are like, oh, well, are we just irrelevant? And absolutely not. Like I don't think so at all. And so again, leveraging the strengths across the board does come from that appreciation of what's gone before, but also a readiness for a change and getting ready to, deal with the new technologies and leverage AI and learn and fail and grow in that regard.
I like your point about being optimistic. There's sorry to go Tony Robbins, but there's a Tony Robbins quote. We'll all get on the chairs and start jumping in a sec. But there's a Tony Robbins quote, something along the lines, I'm going to butcher it, but something along the lines of like the maximum opportunity comes in times of maximum pessimism.
Yeah.
And I think that that's actually really true. Like, how do you kind of, have that optimistic, because it's kind of that whole you can laugh or cry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which one are you going to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there's another quote that oh my gosh, I'm going to butcher as well. I think it's Winston Churchill, something about, no, I can't even remember it. It was something about like innovation pretty much in times of necessity. And I think a lot of people were using it, and we were as well, even just with regards to the pandemic, where it's like, it's a tough time. A lot of organizations had to let people go and strip back to bare bones, but that's when you go through that refinement process and you actually come out stronger on the other side of it. And so, yeah, I think it's definitely, hopefully as a leader, it's encouraging, even though we're talking about, sometimes times of adversity or challenge, but that is when people grow, organizations can grow, even though it might on the outside be rough. But again, that whole idea of holding those things in tension and knowing, of course, when to share with your team about the hard realities, but also like I think we need a sense of realism and optimism. You need both as a leader, which again is a paradox. Like I think our simple human minds go, it's one or the other, which one? But it's actually a tension that we have to mitigate, and oftentimes it's both.
I love that. We're leaning into the tension.
Yeah.
So I have to leave you with a completely different question to finish us up and wrap us up.
Yeah.
Which business book do you recommend the most?
Okay. it is a business book. It's called Why We Sleep. Have you heard of it?
No, and I'm the book crazy lady, so I'm getting onto Amazon right now.
It's amazing. It's a book that I read when we were working on the Work Wellbeing book, because it was about the purpose of work and the role of work in our lives, and we were talking about well-being and health, and I read this book Why We Sleep for that, like as I was reading, just doing a heap of like scoping research about what other work was out there, and read a lot of Adam Grant, Brené Brown, like all the big players, and I love their work. But this book was just so It was so compelling. I would say read it at a time when you're ready for a challenge, because it does, like, it throws into the mix how important sleep is for every aspect of our health personally, but our leadership, our ability to have empathy, emotional intelligence. It does talk about, of course, like the connection between sleep and a range of different diseases and physical health. But it was quite a compelling, I think, read. And the whole idea that if you're a leader, if you're a high performance person, you need to take care of yourself first before you can give to others and lead others well. And just the whole idea that oftentimes when we're busy, sleep's the first thing to go and we don't prioritize it. And it's a lesson I'm still learning. Like, just because I read the book doesn't mean I'm now getting perfect 8 hours of sleep or whatever. But it was such a compelling, interesting read. It was something really different. And I think every person should read it, because I think it will be better parents, better leaders, better family members, better keynote speakers if we're prioritizing our own health. And so many people, even, leading into the pandemic, were experiencing burnout, and it's so hard to operate well and lead people from that place. So if you can look after yourself, and sleep's just, again, not it's not the first thing that should go. It should be the first thing that we prioritize. So I reckon everyone should read it.
I'm going to go get that. But most importantly, I'm going to read it to my 6-year-old who typically stops me from sleeping. So I'm going to read it to him to give him the importance of why I need to sleep and he needs to really stop.
If he takes the advice on, I want to meet him because he's probably like the most advanced 6-year-old ever.
Nah, he'll just be more of a pain in the ass just to spite me.
He's like, hey Siri, can you summarize this book for me?
Yeah, pretty much that's how our household rolls.
Yeah.
Ash, thank you so much. You have been so incredible. If people want to connect with you, obviously you do a huge amount of keynote speaking. If people want to connect and talk about that or some of the generational workshops you've talked about, where are we best to hunt you down and find you other than sleeping? Because we won't stalk you while you're sleeping. That's just
no, please don't.
Rude.
I need to, not after my book recommendation. We've got so many resources like infographics and summaries that I mentioned on our McCrindle website, which is mccrindle.com. But in terms of me personally, I love connecting with people on LinkedIn. So if you just search Ashley Fell on LinkedIn, hopefully it'll come up. But yeah, that's a lot of the place that I talk about. Yeah, some of those kind of in a bit more of a colloquial way. The reports and the research is really polished, but I feel like LinkedIn is a bit more like, this is what we're finding, and a bit more personal. So both those resources and those platforms would work well.
Amazing. I'll get my 6-year-old to search Siri, see what he finds, and then I'll send you a report of whether you can be found properly or not via Siri.
I would love that so much.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe and follow so that you get our unfiltered conversations every single week.